Morning, everyone. Morning. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to start in a few seconds' time, but feel free to get your question in first. You can do that by posting that in the chat, which is denoted by the two speech bubbles in the toolbar. Alternatively, you can pose anonymously your question through, guess what? The button that's denoted Q&A, which you can post and tick anonymous if you want to get your question in first for our panelists today there. I'll mention this again in the middle of the webinar, but a PDF version of the slides will be made available after the webinar alongside a recording of this, which will be sent to you if you have registered there. Thank you. Anybody raising their hands in questions, if you can post that in the chat or in the comments, then we'll take that. If we don't have time for questions, we'll take that offline as well, and our colleagues on the panel will be able to address those there afterwards. Lots of you on this webinar, so we are conscious A, of time, and B, of actually getting around to each and every single question. So let's crack on. I'm delighted that you can join us today on this very interesting and challenging start to the year. Obviously landed with a bang, didn't it, at the end of last year with Consumer Duty there, as the FCA published their review of 180 firms' annual board reports, and to help you prep and also organise yourself for this year's board report. Most welcome Square 4, who we've been working with, I should say award-winning Square 4, congratulations on that. Yeah, Mike Scott and Sarah Howarth, and also Adrian Harvey, CEO of Elephants, don't forget there. Lots to cover off in the 58 minutes that we've got, and we talked about how you can get involved interacting through the poll questions, as well as through the chat that we'll be posing there to you. Also, we're going to be talking about key aspects of what the FCA published at the end of December, particularly focusing on how firms can close the data gaps or weaknesses in your report, improve accuracy and completeness of data, obviously, and also looking very closely at vulnerability. We'll also make sure there's a reference to small firms, which is highlighted in the report. And also number 4, evidencing effective challenge. That came up prominently in the findings of the FCA. And number 5, articulating to the regulator how you are demonstratively improving customer outcomes. If there is anything else that you want to cover off, if that's not good enough for you, then we'll again post it in the chat and we'll take that offline there. So without further ado, let's get to it. And as if you are a follower or a groupie of Elephants Don't Forget webinars, then you know that we always like to start off with a poll question there, which should be on your screen right now there, which is, let's see if we can restart that poll there. Let's do that there. What presented the biggest challenges in writing your first Consumer Duty report there? Obviously, that came in hard stop of the 31st of July of last year. What's the biggest challenges you reckon kept you up at night in writing your first Consumer Duty report there? Delighted to welcome you, Sarah, and also to Mike from Square 4 there. And Sarah, were you busy by any chance in June of July last year, helping and supporting firms?
Absolutely, yes. Very, very busy.
And did the FCA's announcement at the end of December come as a surprise in terms of like what their findings were?
Not really a surprise to us, no, but Merry Christmas from the FCA folks, yeah. That said, I'm a bit of a geek about these matters. I love a bit of feedback from the FCA, but I think the timing works out really, really well for firms. Gives firms time to implement the feedback from the FCA into this year's reports. I think the continued effort from the FCA to provide feedback on areas of concern and good practice to the industry is really welcome. The feedback's not aimed at a particular sector, it's industry-wide, so it can be applied to firms of all shapes and sizes. I think what's really, really interesting is that both the good practice and the areas of feedback really mirrored what we've seen in real life in board reports as well. So that was really interesting. The other thing is it mirrored the best practice that we at Square 4, we produced a board template for firms last year, and the best practice that the FCA have fed back on really mirrored what we put within our own template as well. So that was really pleasing.
Mm. And Mike, when you see those poll reports, thank you very much indeed to those people who participated in that. The first answer by some margin, 57% data quality. Does that surprise you?
No, not in the slightest, Philip. I think that there's been a huge amount of challenge, and we'll talk about it later on with respect to data, and also actually some of the conclusions that firms have drawn with respect to outcomes, and actually do we have sufficient data to support those outcomes. I think more often than not the issue has been no, and actually throughout the distribution chain, do all participating firms have the right level of access to data? It has been a challenge as well, so no, I'm not surprised in the least.
Okay, we'll come on to that and we'll pick up on some of those key points there afterwards. Our second poll question also is on the screen now, may trigger off interesting reports there. How would you rate the quality of your data your firm uses to assess the FCA's compliance to consumer duty? What do you rate as the quality? Don't know, poor, fair, good, or excellent there. Adrian, data may be everywhere, but it doesn't mean to say you've got the insight to accompanying that data, does it?
Listen, data is part of our life. So, I think in the webinars that we ran in 24, evidencing was the big issue. Data was a component of that, but data in itself isn't the job to be done. It's the manipulation of that data into a meaningful management insight. And I think that's where firms have struggled. And I would say new sources of data. Interesting, on that previous poll, the thing that surprised me was board challenge getting 15%. And I think that's going to come up a little bit later in the webinar for some maybe what would appear to be now, Sarah, a bit more contentious discussion.
Yeah, indeed. Sarah, where do you say this? Fair in your assessment and your review of board reports, quality of data middling at 59% is fair. Don't know, 9%. Or 11%. Room for improvement, just like the regulator asks and requested firms to do.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to cover off this in much more detail later on in the webinar, but I think the poll is probably reflective of what we've seen in board reports as well.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, right. So give us the good news, Sarah, then. Where are firms getting it right?
So in terms of where firms are getting it right, so the FCA have given lots of feedback in terms of where firms are getting it right. As we've said on the slide deck here, we've got clear outcomes focus. So firms are backing up their conclusions with robust data quality, analysis of different customer types. So we'd expect vulnerable customers to be included within there. Focuses on culture throughout the firm. We'd expect that to see that within the report. I think data is the biggest thing here. So firms not retrospectively fitting data, their existing MI into the report. So where we've seen good quality reports is they've created new data for the duty. So it's not leaving them with significant gaps. And firms having robust outcomes testing on the end-to-end customer journey. So those are the really good practice areas that we've seen, along with good challenge from the board as well. So we've seen that reflected in board minutes, and that boards are also challenging the right things. So where we've seen like a sea of green metrics, for example, boards are challenging those sea of green metrics. So does it look right? Does it feel right? Obviously, I'm theorizing here, but sometimes maybe boards see something that they don't want to hear. It's right for them to challenge that, but it's also right for them to challenge things that they do want to hear. Also taking effective action as well, particularly where there's poor outcomes for customers, making sure that that action has timescales, they've investigated the root cause, and that there's owners for those actions as well.
And build on that, Mike, if you would do. What are you seeing? What are you understanding from firms' challenges, but also key aspects of what's working well for them?
Yeah, so I think from a challenge perspective, I guess the key areas really, as I've touched on already, is data. And actually, have we got the right sources of data, and are we using that in a meaningful way? Do we have a view across the distribution chain? Again, as I've alluded to. And as we kind of dig into the distribution chain, or actually the customer life cycle from start to finish, do we have a view across different cohorts of customers? The FCA touched on that both in good reports that they've seen and areas for improvement, whereby actually are we considering different groups of customers, pertinently including those with vulnerability as well. And then actually taking a step back, as we collate the report, are we looking at it more regularly than annually? Clearly, are we looking at it on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, and is it receiving the right level of challenge from the board, as Adrian touched on as well? And ultimately, where we do have gaps, the key really is, well, what action is driven on the back of that?
Yeah. And when we look at training, name checked a few times in the FCA's report, Adrian, firms shouldn't get complacent on this by just doing training on consumer duty and expecting it to improve their understanding or their approach to consumer duty. There's a danger that you could be lowered into a false sense of security that you've done training there. There's room for improvement in 2025.
Yeah, we were talking about it earlier in the planning of this. I think a firm's approach to employee training and competence is in itself a litmus test for the culture of the business. And one of the things I see about consumer duty at a macro level, it's about cultural change. And I think if you are, I also personal view, Sarah and I were talking about it earlier, personal view, I think too many firms have approached consumer duty as another thing to be done, right? It's a box to be ticked, and they tick the box, and training and competency is just a component of that. So I've sort of ticked the box. I think the reality is that if your firm has genuinely got a culture where you're putting the consumer at the center of your radar, all of your employees are going to know individually how they contribute to that outcome. And specifically, and more importantly, you can evidence that. In order to get that data, the tone from the top, your C-suite has got to decide that they don't want to be in a tick box type environment, that they genuinely want to change the culture of the organization. Otherwise, you aren't going to get any sources of data other than here, evidence of training. Wow, we did some training. Yeah, that's a very low bar and certainly doesn't fuel the appropriate culture, in my opinion, or evidence that you have the appropriate culture. And it's just a missed opportunity. You do it right, and it's a very credible source of evidence and data that you've got an appropriate culture.
So leading on to data and culture, Sarah, how do firms start to close those gaps and ensure that they've got sufficient quality there? Number one, to justify consumer board report conclusions, but also ensure that there's adequate board assurance.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see from the slide, there were a number of areas of concern, from lack of rationale to setting MI thresholds to insufficient data quality to being unable to aggregate and report MI. Lots and lots of references to data and MI in the FCA's feedback. I can't remember how many times off the top of my head they mention it, but it's numerous times. I know I'm a geek, but I didn't actually count how many times that they mention it, but it's a lot. But having said that, if I had to summarise both the points that you've asked, I would say the biggest areas of concern for the FCA is around lack of sufficient data or data quality to justify conclusions in the report, or to be able to give boards the assurance that they need to meet the obligations under the duty. Now, in terms of our experience in either writing board reports or reviewing them, what I would say around that is either the quality just wasn't there in terms of the MI, or in some cases was completely missing from the report. And there was various reasons for that, which I won't go into. But there's absolutely no reason why the data can't be either a link within the report to the firm's, drive or shared drive, or added as an appendix. And, within the exec summary, it can be a table within the report with links, or, links to the appendix within the report. But in short, the firm needs to be able to justify its conclusions backed up by robust data evidence. That can be in table format, however you want to do it, but you need to be able to justify your conclusions. Secondly, the most important thing is gaps in data. So the FCA commented on a piece of good practice within their feedback, that a firm had identified gaps in their data and set about clear improvement plans in terms of how they would monitor customer outcomes going forward. In our experience, we've also seen that it's really obvious that some firms don't have all the data that they need right now. Let's be realistic about things. It's not a perfect world. We don't have all the data that we might need right now. Firms are going to develop their data strategies over time. But the best reports that we've seen aren't about perfection. They're about realism, and they have a clear plan in place about what their data does or does not tell them. And it has a clear action plan in place with owners, timescales, and plans in place to address the material gaps.
Mike, how else can firms raise their data game then?
To be truthful, I'd probably echo Sarah's points. I guess the key for me really is, as I said, kind of throughout, and I'll probably labour this point throughout continually, being able to justify any conclusions and backing them up with real data evidence. What does this data tell us about customer outcomes? And it actually is spanning the 4 consumer duty customer outcomes. And where we do have any material gaps, do we have clear action plans in place to mitigate those?
Adrian, before the webinar, you talked about the critical importance of data. Obviously, you've got data points. Many of your clients have got millions of data points to access that and understand employee competency across the whole organization. I think that, patience from the regulator's point of view will be running thin, won't it, if you can't start producing that data to evidence continuous improvement or continuous adherence to consumer duty compliance.
Adrian, you're on mute.
Yes, yeah. Sarah makes an interesting point about perfection. There is no requirement to be perfect. And I think best practice firms, certainly from a training competence point of view, should be acknowledging where gaps exist. And Sarah relayed this in her previous response. Where are the gaps? Now, curiously, most firms take a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to employee training competency where everyone passes. The value of this data is 0. Yeah, the very idea that everyone takes an exam and everyone passes, that never happened in any realistic exam that I've ever taken. So I think that the culture, the approach of most of the sector towards employee training and competence, sort of sheep dip type tick box approach, gives you no meaningful data. What you should be doing, in our opinion, obviously, is that you should be having a continual assessment regime, and that will show you where the gaps are, to Sarah's point, such that management can decide what actions they should be taking to address that. So for me, the data, there's far too much lag data. Yeah, you've already caused the problem, detriment. Yeah, where's your lead indicator data? And I think your board report would be hugely more powerful and realistic if you were able to articulate lead indicators of good or not so good culture.
Sarah, we talked about data MI moving up and down the distribution chain. Sharing is caring, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. So there's a couple of things around this for firms to consider, in my view anyway. So within reports, they need to give a clear overview of any third-party relationships that the firm has and any outsourced relationships as applicable, and the monitoring of those relationships that have taken place over the course of the year. The report should also, secondly, describe any processes that are in place, as well as any evidence to ensure that relevant information has been shared and received across that distribution chain. Now, the FCA within their feedback gave a few examples of this. They talked about templates being used, feedback templates. So some firms used feedback templates to share information across the distribution chain and to collect data. Another example that they gave was a particular insurance firm. They conducted monitoring of their third parties, and they gave dates, results, outcomes, etc., of that particular monitoring. They also described the foreseeable harms that they could see as part of that monitoring as well, particularly if the third party wasn't running their processes correctly. Foreseeable harms obviously being a key part of the duty. In terms of the examples that we've seen as part of our board reports that we've reviewed, I've seen data from individual product providers being shared to individual firms and vice versa back again, and firms have put that within their reporting. I've also seen training provided, so where the firm has noticed within their outcomes monitoring that they've got a particular issue with a particular product, training has been then requested from that product provider. They've then, off the back of that training, monitored outcomes again. So that has been included in board reporting. So
Nice.
That's just another example.
Mike, yeah, so what Sarah was saying, better identification required and better understanding of where there are data gaps up and down the distribution chain, but also the need to flag and address concerns that both provider and also recipient of that data, and crunching that data, scrutinizing it with granularity is what the FCA now expects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the primary purposes of consumer duty has been to fuse the relationship between manufacturer and distributor, and the duty has reinforced that regardless of your role in the chain, you have obligations from a regulatory perspective to achieve good customer outcomes. So I think looking at the column on the right, the two areas that jump out to me, establishing clear data definition standards and improving information exchange within distribution chains. So what does that look like in practice? It's defining standards as early as you can. So be clear on what you can automate, standardize for periodic reporting, so more of your quantitative data, and also being clear on actually what areas need to be shared ad hoc, so as and when specific issues might arise, and would require further detail and narrative as to kind of what cannot be automated or standardized. So issues around outcomes, for example, poor outcomes, complaints, and any kind of key issues within the distribution.
Adrian, you can't outsource, as we all know on this webinar, outsource your responsibilities to consumer duty. But even if you're outsourcing, let's say, a call center or a customer contact center there, though it is possible, isn't it, to make sure that the integrity of employee competency at the sharp end is actually monitored and addressed and actually challenged in a way with correct data wherever you are along that distribution chain.
Yeah, I think this is a big Achilles heel for a lot of firms. Outsourcing is popular for good reason. Yeah, it doesn't matter what your personal opinion is. It is a fact of life. A lot of firms are going to outsource. And I see a general attitude of that's my supplier's problem. I think it's a really weak position. I would not want to be in that position. Our customers who outsource have the benefit of visibility of actual competence along that supply chain. So they can track it, they can have adult collaborative conversations with their outsourcer around, look, this is a problem for us. Yeah, we need you to work on this to improve that so we get better customer outcomes. In the absence of that sort of technology, you are absolutely reliant on what that supplier gives you. And I would suggest possibly that they may have a vested interest in giving you a rosy picture.
Sarah, it wouldn't be a consumer duty webinar, would it, if we didn't talk about vulnerable customers, would it, in some shape or form there? In the report, the FCA, got it here, flagged that some firms haven't sufficiently delineated outcomes for vulnerable customers under each of the 4 specific outcomes. And they're also critical of firms' attempts to differentiate between customer types, which you flagged and highlighted on this particular slide, across the various sections of the board report itself.
Yeah, so there's a number of hurdles that I guess firms need to overcome, and firms have got to seriously start asking some questions around this. And the questions I would be asking myself, if I was thinking about these areas, there's 3 areas I would be thinking about. One is product and service design, and the questions I'd be thinking about is, did the firm understand their target market, and are their services designed with vulnerable clients in mind? How well do the products and services, are they designed with vulnerable customers in mind? Where are they falling short? What improvements are needed? What actions are needed? And how are they measuring and monitoring the success of the outcomes with these particular products and services? So that's for products and services design. Then for data collection and quality, how robust and reliable is the firm's data on customer vulnerability? That's really, really key. Certainly in the reports that we've seen, data around customer vulnerability is certainly a weaker area. What steps are being taken to ensure data accuracy and completeness? Going back to data gaps, how is the firm identifying those gaps and addressing those gaps? And how is the firm ensuring that their data analysis reflects the needs and experiences of vulnerable customers? And then talking about your point around analysis of different customer types. So the FCA have laboured this point over and over and over again. It's really important that a firm considers its approach to the monitoring of outcomes of different customer types. Vulnerable customers form part of that. So a big question the firm that needs to ask themselves is, off the back of monitoring, have they identified any issues or weaknesses that they need to feed back into product design or service design as part of a continuous feedback loop? So you identify an issue, you look into the root cause of it. Do you need to feed that back into your product or service design at the start? What do you need to change? So you need to ask that question. Have the firm identified and analysed the needs of all customer types? What processes and systems do you have? Are they inclusive and accessible to everyone? So thinking about your communications with customers, your services that you have, and are there specific needs of vulnerable customer segments that are not being addressed? So they're the main questions that I would be asking. I can't answer for all firms, obviously. I can only say that in the reviews that we've conducted of board reports, those are the types of questions I would be asking as I'm reviewing a board report. Can I answer those types of questions?
You mean you can't answer questions for 60,000 firms? Oh, come on. Yeah.
Absolutely not. I'm good, but I'm not that good, Philip.
Mike, talk to us about effective board challenge on issues around vulnerable customers then.
Yes, it's absolutely critical. Let's be clear. I think firms have to be transparent, and they probably need to ask themselves a couple of things. The first point really is where and how are we actively challenging our approach to identification of vulnerable customers, and does this mitigate risks in that space? And then the second point really is how are we effectively overseeing the implementation of our own vulnerability strategy, and is that effective as well? I think these are two areas that the FCA will be likely to probe further on.
We had a quite punchy conversation prior to the webinar, Adrian, about board competency and understanding around vulnerability itself. And our own previous webinars have outed, and thank you for disclosing and sharing so much information in 2024 around consumer duty, but only something like 20% of boards actually have any training whatsoever on vulnerability. And that is, and when we drill down into it, the frequency of that training was, guess what, once a year. So individuals at the top end of our organizations making decisions about their approach to vulnerability, that doesn't really give the FCA much confidence, does it?
Don't know, I'm not the FCA, but it doesn't give me much confidence. Again, it's back to this litmus test, and it's a red flag. Yeah, I mean, vulnerability is it is the hobby horse of the regulator, right? So if you're getting this wrong, it's not new news. It's on everything they do, and if your culture of your business is such that you only 20% of your people or your senior people are trained, how can they possibly challenge what's going on in the business? How can they credibly challenge that? And if they're doing it once a year, and by the way, training is not the objective, competence is. And if you change your mindset and you view it in that way, then every interaction your people have with a customer is an opportunity to improve your insight. And if that's your mindset, yeah, you really have a genuine culture. It's not, I get asked, should we do a check every year? Well, every time you speak to the customer, your people should be sufficiently competent, comfortable, yeah, and confident to add to your insight on that customer. And then to determine whether or not something additional or alternative action is required for that customer at that point in time. So I really, for me, it's a litmus test. It's a red rag to a bull. If I were a regulator, I would just look at that and say, show me the training, who took it, how come none of the board took it?
Yeah, fair shout. Building on that, Sarah, how do firms and the FCA talk about this, don't they? In the report, avoid rubber stamping the board reports. And you gave some interesting stories, as did I, about some CEOs just going, yeah, or some boards going, yeah, that looks okay. How do they stop that or avoid that in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, we'll come on to the boardroom challenge in the next sort of section, but in terms of vulnerability, I think can't speak today, need to put my teeth in. I'd say board members need to review their vulnerability metrics and MI with sort of greater frequency and in greater detail if they're not doing so already. And not just do it when the board report comes in for approval. So I'd expect that review to take place in the various meetings and forums on an ongoing basis, not just when the board report comes in. Again, that kind of goes back to the earlier point that we were talking about. What are the board challenging? Are they challenging the right things, the right metrics, including vulnerability in that?
Yeah, sorry, Philip. I'd agree. And I'd probably have two more questions on that, really, is from a board perspective, what steps are necessary to ensure that we use the right quality data to inform our decision making in relation to vulnerability? And then secondly, how is this data collected, validated and analysed? And just to signpost, we've recently published a rather comprehensive white paper in the vulnerability space, which will help go some way in answering some of these questions.
And we'll name check that report in the chat there. Keep your questions coming in, and if I can ask panelists to lean in on what's popped up, because there's some really good questions about outcomes monitoring, also data in the distribution chain, and proportionality around smaller firms. The report does name check smaller firms, and they are sensitive to the challenges around smaller firms in terms of like producing and publishing their board reports there. Certainly, we talked about robust challenge. I'm Sarah here, and I was struck by an article that I read just prior to Christmas that said that something like 46% of financial services businesses wish they gained greater board level leadership and representation in terms of like that output and their input into their approach to consumer duty and also customer outcomes. Do you think that the FCA is therefore right in terms of like scrutinizing the fact that some boards are not challenging as much as they could do on the board report?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, isn't it? We've not seen the sample of board reports that were submitted to the FCA, and there could be numerous reasons why a board might not challenge the content of a report. So we could surmise and opine all day as to the reasons why a board might challenge or not challenge the contents of a particular board report. But I think the FCA have been really, really clear in their feedback that firms can't be seen as a rubber stamp, or boards can't be seen as a rubber stamp to approval of that board report, and that effective challenge is absolutely vital to ensure that the report evidences compliance with the duty. I think the other expectation that the FCA were really clear on as well is that the report is produced in conjunction with involvement and input from various areas of the business, from committees, forums, other stakeholders, so that the board isn't the sole area of approval for that report. So you've got layers of subject matter expertise coming into that report. And I think the best reports that we have seen is where that has occurred. So you've got opinions provided by consumer duty champions, for example, providing that independent scrutiny, as well as, chief risk officers giving their opinion as well on perhaps assurance that's been completed throughout the year, and does that mirror what first line's findings are of outcomes. So the best reports we have seen have provided that independent view and opinion into the report.
Mike, effective board challenge is linked certainly to better data quality, information sharing, as well as overall effective action, wouldn't you say?
100%. And strong challenge really is likely to involve questioning the quality and the reliability of the data and ensuring transparency throughout the information flow. And as we said throughout, how can you draw robust conclusions without robust evidence supporting those conclusions?
Adrian, you've been at the top of the table of some pretty large firms there. How and where can you be encouraging, or would you be encouraging your board to push back or challenge on what they are being presented to or by?
I think this is really insightful, and you should look in the mirror and say, how did our firm approach this? If I were running a reasonably large firm, the board report would occur every month. It wouldn't be a thing to be done on a given day. That would just be that month's board report. So if the culture of the organization was to put the customer at the center of our radar, Yeah, if Consumer Duty really was real in this mythical firm that I'm running, yeah, every month the various functions within the business would be feeding up into a report on how our business is performing under this obligation called Consumer Duty. And then on a given date, we file a one for that month. So the idea that this is all being ignored and then suddenly some poor project manager gets thrown under the bus to produce a Consumer Duty report, which then gets signed off on, I think that's again this litmus test, it's this red flag. And we know from webinars last year, Philip, that a lot of firms were reporting to us candidly, look, this report's being done and just given to the board, and the board's just signing it off and getting on with business. And the regulator I think the regulator's aware of this. And that's why I raised that point about 15% at the beginning in the first poll, to say that's quite interesting that the audience feel that the challenge is there and it's robust and real, because I'm not sure the regulator agrees.
I'm sorry, I want to build on that point, because it does say, doesn't it? It does name check that, the FCA have noticed that it's been compliance who have, and their words, not mine, solely written the board report there. That can't wash, can it, in 2025? Surely not.
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt.
Okay, so when we look at outcomes monitoring, I know that you guys have done a great paper on this as well. I'll post that in the chat there before the end of the webinar there. 18 times and 14-page report. The FCA mentions monitoring there. There's a clue in that, Sarah, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? That's for sure. But if we think back to the FCA's Consumer Duty 1 year in webinar, they did mention that outcomes monitoring was one of the biggest challenges that firms are currently facing, price and value being the other big challenge. So firms are definitely going to need to raise their game in terms of the approach to outcomes monitoring in 2025. So the FCA have reported in the last year that there's still an excessive focus on completion of process rather than outcomes monitoring. Reports still contain limited oversight into customer outcomes themselves, so there's limited oversight actually being carried out, and there's a lack of I guess evidence of where monitoring has actually directly led to proactive action to improve outcomes. So again, we go back to this lack of evidence and lack of proactive action taking place.
Mike, we often forget that the FCA uses their own outcomes monitoring framework to test, obviously, on the outcomes produced and delivered to customers there. How do you think firms should deal with foreseeable harm and also issues like detriment in 2025, and therefore reflect that? Number of questions on how honest should I be about where we're lacking and where the gaps are in our board report?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're quite right. Often when the FCA undertakes supervisory activity, the first thing they'll do is request a sample of files, and then they'll undertake file reviews on the back of that. That sample can be as small as 5. Let's be candid, and then scale up. If we look at conduct risk through a similar outcome testing lens, this gives you as a firm the opportunity to align perspectives and understand, actually, do we have any issues in this space, and can we preempt broader regulatory intervention? And as you quite rightly said, Philip, we've designed an award-winning outcome testing methodology, which we can post references to in another one of our papers.
Let's talk about culture. It's a hobby horse of ours, as well as the regulator now, and also in the past on webinars there. We talked about sometimes it being solely compliance-led, Sarah, on there. We have a question in the chat also, the role and importance of the Consumer Duty champion within the organisation. But all eyes will be focused on how individuals can take ownership of culture tone from the top, but also tone from the middle there. Pick up on a couple of those points there.
Yeah, and so what we've seen, certainly in some firms, not all, and certainly in the FCA's feedback, the FCA have certainly fed back that compliance teams have taken the accountability and responsibility for writing and producing the report, and that's certainly the case that we've seen in some firms as well. Our view is, and I guess the FCA's view as well, is that responsibility should ideally sit within the first line, with the second line providing input and oversight. As I mentioned before, there's some good practice of second line providing input into the report and an independent overview. I guess my view is that compliance writing the report, it could imply that the firm see the report production as, merely a regulatory issue, a regulatory matter, rather than something that the business themselves are responsible for and accountable for. So I guess it's what the optics look like, and it speaks of the culture of the firm and the tone from the top. In terms of the consumer duty champion, what we've got in our template in terms of guidance is an independent overview from that CD champion on the implementation and the embedding of the duty within the firm, what their responsibilities are. And we've also given guidance around the 10 questions that the FCA have published previously in consumer duty guidance. Can the firm answer those 10 questions? So the consumer duty champion has provided responses to those questions within the template. So that's what I can answer around those particular points.
Adrian, what will shift the cultural dial in 2025? So the regulator, so firms can actually say, have some of that regulator there, because something's got to change. This is all about continuous improvement, right? And if that's so, the metrics around cultural measurement, cultural understanding, embedding that the regulator, quite rightly, and also stakeholders would want to see. That's got to be the North Star of all firms, shouldn't it?
I'm not sure I'd advocate a strategy or even mindset of have some of that to the regulator. Although we do
technical word I learned on my MBA.
I think that's probably more British Army than MBA. Anyway, so I think that we've got quite a few customers who actually welcome the interaction with the regulator on these points because they feel they're in a very strong position. There is a concept called shadow the leader, and that broadly, I'm probably going to completely misquote some poor academic who's done all of this work, that broadly says if your leader, if the board are really not that genuinely fussed about something, chances are, was more than chances are, statistically, the rest of the organisation will follow their lead. So they cast a shadow over the organisation, be it middle management or frontline staff. So if the mood music, or if, in our parlance, if the shadow of the leadership of that business is that consumer duty is a job to be done, a box to be ticked, the culture of that organisation will reflect that. Yeah. So, and you will not change it. You will not change the army from the bottom. Yeah. You'll change it from the top. So the way that firms have ultimately, and I've written a couple of articles on this recently, it has to be, the firm has to see, the exec has to see a value in changing. Because for as long as the motivation to change is extrinsic, i.e. they're lent on by the regulator, change will be slow and resisted. As soon as the board recognise and accept and embrace that this change is good for the business, intrinsic motivation, change, fun enough, will be really, really quick, and the culture will be good. So at the moment, it is a battle between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to change, and I currently see the vast majority of the marketplace looking at consumer duty as an extrinsic force. We are being forced to do this, and whilst that prevails, I think the regulator is going to be disappointed with the culture that they see in the marketplace. And who can blame the marketplace, right?
And where do we see, Mike, the regulator casting their all-seeing eye in 2025?
So I think it's clear that there will be continued targeted and thematic reviews in this space. And ultimately, for any firms whom the regulator deem not to have driven the necessary improvements, I suspect there will be further action.
And key considerations, Sarah, for this year's, I should say, not next year's, but this year's board report. And there, we've got our lucky squares on the screen, 6 of them there. Pick a square, any square, where you think that X marks the spot where firms should perhaps prioritize or focus in on.
It's like a game show, isn't it?
Yeah, fingers on buzzers.
Okay. I'm going to pick risk mitigation, and I'll tell you why. In a number of board reports that I've reviewed, risks were not apparent in terms of being evidence. That isn't to say the firm weren't mitigating them or even documenting them somewhere. It's just in the board report, they weren't evident. So when writing board reports, please can you consider the material risks and issues faced by the firm and document them, please.
Mike?
So I'll leave number 5 for Adrian, I suspect. Data accuracy for me. Ultimately, yeah, as it says on the box there, what we put in, we get out. And as I've said throughout, we've seen so many reports where conclusions are drawn, which we just haven't got sufficient information from which to draw those conclusions. So really, yeah, let's focus on the data, the quality of the data. Is it showing transparency and visibility of customer outcomes, or for consumer duty customer outcomes throughout the customer life cycle? And does it give us a meaningful set of data from which we can draw conclusions and challenge them at the right level?
Actually, I'm not going with accountability. I'm going to go with what you can't see, which I think is testament to what you've just said, Mike. I think a lot of firms can't see, for example, the actual level of competence, that's relevant in their firm. They're flying blind. So I would say the focus for me is what you can't see. These are sources of data that are available, and some of your peers are harvesting that data and then understanding where the gaps are and making decisions and using that information to support the conclusions in their board report. We're really good at this, and here's the evidence, because our people are on their game and we measure it every day. There's a gap here. We know this. We acknowledge it. Here's the source of data, and these are the actions that we're taking to rectify it. So for me, I think it's, I would be asking myself the question, what can't I see and what would I like to see? Yeah,
I like that one there. We've got a number of questions that we'd love you to engage upon also. Some of you have asked and name-checked the Square 4 board report template there, which we posted, Maddie's posted in the chats there. We also ask you to reach out if you want to engage and discuss with Square 4 in a bit more detail how they can help and support in the understanding and the expectation of your consumer duty report, and making sure that you're tip-top condition for submission readily in July 2025 there. You can submit it before that time, as we all know there. You also have the opportunity to reach out to Clever Nelly to see how you can improve and enhance and evidence performance improvement and culture improvement within your annual board report. And also from all parties, you have the opportunity to be able to access blogs, papers, podcasts, webinars on consumer duty and all related issues there. It's going to be a busy year in 2025 for consumer duty as well there. Panelists, I'd like you to look at the chat because there's some great questions there. I don't know, Mike, do you want to go first and pick up any 1 or 2 questions that you see in the chat and there? Opportunity. It's not so much time that we actually get opportunities to get questions because we're so busily geeking out on our information and our content imparting to you there. But Sarah and Mike, any ones that jump out to you for understanding and grasping some of the key concepts that we've shared on this webinar today?
Sorry, just skimming through. I think, as Adrian touched on at the outset, Philip, any questions that we don't get to, we'll work to provide more of a comprehensive response post the session. But yeah, let me just pick a couple out.
I mean, there's some pretty deep questions in there, Philip, that probably need a bit of reflection. Yeah, I mean, Andrew Gething's last comment there, we could talk, all three of us, I'm sure, could talk for some time about that last comment, and it's not an easy answer. And let's be clear, you know, I'm very sympathetic. This whole issue of consumer duty, yeah, is not an easy thing. I think it should be recognised quite the level of strain it places on a lot of firms, especially smaller firms.
And so, as we review the questions, here's the one that you just posted on the screen now. What will be your biggest challenge or challenges in writing this year's Consumer Duty Board report there? Is it clear outcomes, data quality, analysts analysing customer types, clear process, culture and business strategy, or board challenge? So based upon what Sarah, Adrian and Michael have said, what will actually give you either food for thought or challenge you a bit more this year? Let's see what you say there. There you go. 54% still on data quality, Sarah. There. And then we have, what do we have? Customer types, 30%. Clear outcomes focus there. Difficult to have data points if you don't understand what a good outcome is, isn't there? Is there still issues around definitions of what a good outcome is, Sarah?
Yeah, those answers don't surprise me at all, and in considering the work that we've been carrying out with firms, data quality being one of them, but it all kind of links in with outcomes monitoring frameworks that we've been carrying out with firms, and the production of those frameworks and enhancement of those frameworks, along with price and value as well, assessments of price and value. So those results do not shock me in the slightest.
A bit of an uptick on culture and business strategy. Adrian, 24%. Boardroom challenge, I think, was ticking out, coming in. Yeah, exactly. At 15% there, but this is coming out at 16%. There hasn't shifted there. But a clear focus by our 400 guests who we've got on this, and Mike, around our customer types. That's going to be a key focus of the regulator as well. Obviously, H1 is where we're going to get final guidance, sorry, Q1, final guidance from the regulator on vulnerability and vulnerable customers there. That's going to be a key aspect, and that's got to segue into each of the four, you know, outcomes there. Do you see issues and challenges around understanding that as a firm and then actually representing, reflecting that in the board report itself?
Absolutely. I think in terms of different customer types, I think the challenges at the outset in terms of definition of target market, and then as we move into the distribution chain, actually, does the distributor have the same view as the manufacturer with respect to the target market and any challenges within that space? I think Andrew in the chat raises a really interesting point that Adrian touched on as well around the data quality and the lack of. So ultimately, you can only work with what you've got, and what you don't have, you don't have. So, and this is becoming increasingly difficult throughout the distribution chain, and there's an emphasis from a regulatory perspective on broker oversight as well, or intermediary oversight and what that looks like, and there's more of an emphasis on kind of lender obligations with respect to data. It comes back to, are we setting out expectations at the very start as to what that data might look like, and are we working together to enhance it? And I think we also need to give ourselves a bit of leeway and recognise that with respect to data, a lot of this is still new. Granted, the regulator is expecting things to be moving, but it's iterative as well. Would be my key takeaway on that point.
Absolutely. And for this year, you know, certainly lots coming in from the regulator on consumer duty. Are they, Sarah, now more prepared and expected firms to respond rapidly to the expectations of the regulator? So are you seeing basically a greater understanding of what is expected, and therefore firms are in a better position than they were, say, this time last year on what to put into the board report this year?
Yeah, so last year it was the first board report post the implementation. So, I think the expectation of the FCA is, or was, it's 1 year in, there's going to be some teething problems, things are not going to be perfect. We're going to be 2 years in this year. We're moving to the embedding stage. I think the FCA's expectations are going to be rising and rising each year. That standards bar is rising and rising each year. The FCA have been pretty good so far at giving feedback, doing reviews, giving feedback on firms. You wonder when that patience may run out. It's difficult to tell with the FCA. They did say in their 1 year in webinar that they were not going to push the big stick approach just yet. However, if they engaged with firms, they would expect those firms to put things right. If they didn't put things right, then obviously enforcement could take place at that point. So we're not expecting big stick approach right now. However, watch this space as time goes on. The expectation is there that firms will improve over time.
There you go. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Mike, for a good webinar, first one of the year. And thank you, the audience, for participating in this and actually sharing so many questions as well. We'll take those offline as promised, alongside a PDF version of the slides, as well as a recording. Oh, come on, stop it with the high fives and whatever, the thumbs up. But we'll take them anyway, don't get me wrong.
Don't tell them to stop.
Yeah.
Next month.
Yeah, it's sort of about continuous improvement. So we've got a webinar coming up at the end of the month as well, on key risks and top risks that your firm should be addressing now and in the near future. Thanks very much for your time and have a great day.
Cheers, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, all.